Okay, so in this video, we are going to go over some basic modeling strategies. And the first thing that we want to think about here as we start to model, again, now that we know a little bit about topology, is we want to think about how we move things around effectively. And, in order to know how to do that, we have to know a little bit about how Maya behaves and a couple of basic principles. The first principle that we're going to learn is we're going to learn about the idea of working in a low poly workflow. Now, that sounds a little bit cumbersome at first, but you will get the hang of this. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a few boxes. And each one of these boxes is going to have a different number of different amounts of geometry on it. So right now, this box right here, all these boxes actually, have the minimum number of components that you could have to create a box. In other words, if we get rid of any of these components here, we would no longer have a box, right? We've got 1 point for each corner, but we can also expand that, right? We could make this what is known as a higher poly object. So if we go to our settings here and we expand the resolution, I'm going to make this so that it has a lot more geometry on it, on this one. And then I'm going to make this one a ton of geometry. So what I've done on these objects here is that you can see right now on this box right here, and we'll talk about how I did this in a second, is I've got, again, the minimum here. This is the low poly box. And here we've got a little bit more. And if I click here, you can see that I can grab these vertices and move them around like so. And I can do the same thing here, but I've got a ton of geometry on this one, right? Now, there are scenarios where you'd want to have a box that looks like this or this, but most of the time your goal should be to kind of keep it more like this. In modeling, you always want to try to get away with as little geometry as you can until you have to add more. And the reason is that, just like, think about this like a really gigantic Photoshop file with a really, really high resolution, right? And that's pretty much what this is, right? This box has a ton of information on it, but it doesn't describe anything with greater detail than this one, right? They all look the same. If I turn off my wireframe over shaded, all three of these boxes look identical. But this one is cheap, as they say, and this one is expensive, meaning that this one costs a lot in terms of disk space and processing power and all of that kind of stuff. So it takes a lot more to move this thing around and to model it than this does. But not only that, but the fewer points that you have, the easier it is to move something around. So if I wanted to grab this corner here and just drag it up and down, it's very easy for me to do that because all I've got to do is grab these 2 points and move them around. If I want to do that here, just selecting those points, I got to select everything on the edge. So I got to be really careful, right? If I grab this, I've I accidentally selected this, so that's not going to work, right? So we've got to make sure that we don't select those. But you can see that I can only move around. I'm not able to move it around with the exact same freedom, right? I can't affect as much change on the object as I could this when I just grabbed those couple of points there. Right? And then good luck trying to do anything with this one, right? This is just too much geometry. And again, there are times when you're going to want this, right? But not for what we're doing right now. Always sort of shoot for as little as possible. So let's look at what that means. So first of all, when we create objects in Maya, if I create a sphere here, so I'm just going to click once on the sphere button, it's going to create that right in the middle of the scene. And by default, it creates that with a certain resolution on the geometry, right? Now, there is a more ideal resolution to start at. And one of the questions we'll always be asking ourselves as we work is, what is the right resolution to start with? And with a sphere, or let's also look at a cylinder here, there are proper resolutions and minimum resolutions. It's easy with a box, right? Because we can say, okay, this box, we know the minimum number of points. But what's the minimum number of points for a sphere or a cylinder? How little can we get by with here? or here, for example. So to adjust that, there's a few ways you can adjust this number right off the bat. So when you're getting started, if you want to change this, which almost always you will, you can do a few things. My favorite way to do this, and I recommend you doing this, is when you create your objects for the first time. Let's say I want to create a sphere here. Problem is, the default, this is not the most useful default. This is like a 20 by 20 sphere, right? It's 20 bands horizontally, 20 bands vertically. Not that useful. So I want to change the default. So to do that, I go to my Create menu here, and I scroll down to Polygon Primitives, over to Sphere, and then over to this little thing called a marking menu. And what this does is it expands an option box for the sphere. So if I do that, it brings up this window right here. And this, you can see, you can adjust the number of divisions. And the number of divisions that you want as your default is going to be 8 by 8. And then hit Create. And now we get a sphere that looks like this. Much more lean and mean and low poly and easy to work with, right? And now the cool thing about this is if I delete this and I hit the sphere button, my 20 by 20 has been replaced by the 8 by 8. So now automatically in the future, I get an 8 by 8 sphere every time for free. And so that's the easiest way to make the adjustment. But let's say you want to adjust it really quick after you've created it. The best way to do that is you can go into your channel box here. And as you remember, we can do that by clicking on that little stack of papers here. There's this little tab that says Inputs and Polysphere. And if you click on that, you can adjust the subdivisions there. So I can just click on subdivisions and then right or left click and middle mouse click and drag in the viewport to drag that up and down. So if I wanted, say, a 16 by 16, I could change it there. So there's that. You can do that from the channel box. You can also actually do it from the attribute editor. So if I click on the attribute editor here, we see Polysphere 1. Again, that corresponds to P-Sphere 1, the name. And I can change that with a slider here as well. So it's very important to know how to do this stuff. And you'll see that no matter what object you create, so if I create a box, you can do that same thing. If I go to Polycube here, I can change, the subdivisions for all the objects there. But you'll notice that if I change them there, it won't change the actual default number. It's going to give me that back. And you almost always want the 1 by 1 by 1 to be your default box. Very rarely would you want to change that. But I do want to probably change my cylinder as a default to 8 by 8. So if I go to cylinder, scroll over to my marking menu here, I'm going to change this from axis division 16 to 8 and then hit create. And that's a nice number there. And I actually might want to get rid of these vertical divisions as well. So I can go back to my primitives, polygon primitives, go to cylinder, and then change my height divisions maybe to 2. And then we get something more like that. And that's a nice default. That's pretty useful, right? And the same thing is going to be true for other objects. Now, the main objects that you're going to use, you're very rarely going to use the cone, but you will use the sphere, the box, the cylinder, and the torus, and the grid or the flat plane here. So, but just you can kind of ignore the cone. It's not very useful, but these objects are all good and they all kind of can be adjusted in the same way. So again, 8 by 8, that's the magic number, right? And the reason we like 8 by 8 is because this is the minimum size that you can create a sort of smooth circle with. But 8 also has some kind of other really cool properties to it. Like, for example, you wouldn't want something like 9. Because 9, if we look at it, right? So if we're looking at this, let's look at this from the top view. This is sort of an awkward shape, right? Because we've got a weird line right here. We've got a nice flat angle here, but not here and not here where we'd want it. You'll notice that 8 is great, right? Because those lines are perfectly oriented on our axes, right? And we get a nice 45-degree angle there. And that's true for the sphere as well as for the cylinder. So it's very important to kind of be conscious of that number. You're always going to be thinking in terms of 8s or multiples of 8. So 16 is actually really good as well. Now, it's kind of, this seems a little bit irrelevant right now, but you'll see how important this is when we actually start to model, right? Okay, so let's stop this video here, and in the next video we'll start to kind of get a little bit more into the modeling process.